I begin by acknowledging that the state of Kansas in the United States, where I am, is home to the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee nations. And today, Kansas is home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo tribe of Kansas, the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. The land that serves as the foundation of Kansas State University, which is where I teach, was and still is stolen land. I believe that my talk today runs 45 minutes, maybe 50, I'm not sure. And as Matea says, after which there will be time for questions, suggestions, criticisms, whatever you like. I'm eager to learn from you and your feedback. So, in fairness to my father, reading about his racism on his son's blog was never likely to begin a constructive conversation. Our relationship was already strained. He considered me brainwashed by the liberal media, and so I never imagined that he would read what I had written. Oh, I should have imagined, but I did not. It was June 2015, and an armed white supremacist had murdered 9 worshipers at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, a city where I lived for 2 years in the late 1990s. On his jacket, the murderer wore both a Confederate flag and the flag of apartheid-era South Africa, the country where my parents and their parents grew up and where many of my relatives still live. Drawing comparisons between the American South and South Africa, I addressed the need to confront the racism in one's own family, concluding the first paragraph with, and I quote, "My father believes the canard that Barack Obama's presidency is illegitimate because the president was born not in Hawaii, as his birth certificate indicates, but in Kenya." As I said then, I understand why descendants of Confederates or of other warriors for white supremacy want to feel good about their relatives, and they can feel good about their relatives, but just not about the racist part. And I spoke of how we can both love and disagree with these relatives. When my father happened upon the blog post the following month, he was not able to hear the love part of that. Understandably, what activist Loretta J. Ross proposes would have been a better approach. As a critique of call-out culture, she advocates call-in culture, in which you invite someone into a conversation. As she says, when you think someone has done something wrong and you want to hold them accountable, you don't react with anger or hate. You just remain calm and look at them and say, "That's an interesting viewpoint. Tell me more." When addressing racist family or friends, Ross's approach is much more likely to succeed than my blunt confrontation. My talk today is personal, and for me, it's an experiment. It's the first draft of the first chapter in the Misuses of Enchantment, Childhood, Nostalgia, and Who We Are. The book itself, which is under contract with Oxford, considers how the American authoritarian movement is using children's literature and children's education to further its aims. In the US, this is perhaps most visible in the rise of book bans, all of which seem motivated by what Svetlana Boym calls restorative nostalgia, that longing for an uncomplicated imaginary past that seems to explain our fractured, precarious present. Other varieties of nostalgia, such as what Boym calls reflective, challenge these totalizing narratives, lingering in the loss and the brokenness that restorative nostalgics deny. And since nostalgia of any variety longs for childhood, both real and imagined, I want to reckon with histories both personal and national by considering how nostalgia shaped 2 childhoods, mine and my father's. In this, the sole autobiographical chapter in the book, as I say, this is an experiment. I hope to use my story as a vehicle for some practical advice in doing anti-racist education, such as adopt Ross's call-in approach. So in one sense, this is do as I say, not as I did. But in another sense, this is about the need in doing any thoughtful work to learn from our mistakes and to learn from our own history, national history, family history, personal history, often prevents us from perceiving those mistakes. In the US, I think I'm mostly known as the guy who called out Seuss's racism. But before writing Was the Cat in the Hat Black, my own record on Seuss and racism was mixed. In my earlier work, I present Seuss as an artist who, as he became more aware of racism and wrote picture books that were intended as anti-racist parables, also created work that is less racist. I presented him as an artist who evolved. That's really only half correct. As was true in his 1940s cartoons, Seuss in his 1950s picture books was creating both racist and anti-racist work at the same time. I think many of us grew up believing, and I certainly grew up believing, that you're either on team racism or you're on team anti-racism. However, racism is not an either or, it's a both and. Starting in childhood, we absorb racist images and ideas without our awareness and without our consent. And Seuss was not aware of how thoroughly his own imagination was steeped in a white supremacist culture. And if I'm honest with myself, neither am I. Childhood racism is just so ordinary. It's so part of the fabric of daily life that it's easily forgotten. Until something reminds you. Last summer, boarding the plane, some passengers changed seats so that a couple could sit on the same side of the aisle. Others had to pause boarding for a moment. A white man at the front of the line chuckled and said to another white man, "It's a Chinese fire drill." And I thought, wow, there's a racist expression I haven't heard in a long time. It means a kind of ineffectual chaos, and there are many other such expressions and games and playground taunts from my childhood that I've forgotten that I know. Until I remember. Anyway, a nagging sense of doubt that I'd not successfully grappled with Seuss and race in my earlier work was the genesis of Was the Cat in the Hat Black? The title chapter is a corrective to my earlier work on Seuss, and it would be a better chapter if I had done in the book what I am explicitly doing right now, acknowledging the flaws in my earlier work, because the first step in learning how to break up with your favorite racist children's books is being willing to admit that you were wrong. The stories we hear and read as children have an outsized impact on the adults we become. As Maria Sachiko-Cicere puts it, children's literature makes up much of the mental furniture of childhood and therefore can powerfully shape human interiority in a world that values childhood as the foundation of adult identity. Her claim also applies to the national and personal stories we hear in childhood. These too frequently commingle facts and fictions in ways that we cannot perceive at the time. They form powerful heuristics, rule of thumb strategies for thinking about the world and our place in it. Two such heuristics, Make America Great Again and Make Childhood Innocent Again, embody Michael Common's observation that nostalgia is essentially history without guilt. And imagining themselves and their ancestors as blameless, adherents of this restorative nostalgia exempt themselves from history and its legacy in the present. In How the Word is Passed, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America, poet and scholar Clint Smith visits Virginia's Blandford Cemetery, the gravesite of 30,000 Confederate soldiers. It's Memorial Day, and the sons of Confederate veterans are there to honor their dead and the lost cause for which they fought. Proponents of this myth allege that the American Civil War was not about slavery and was not racist, even though it definitely was both of those things. So when Paul C. Gramling Jr., the event's keynote speaker and the leader of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, says that people who want to remove Confederate monuments are terrorists, Smith, the sole black person in the audience, describes the violence of this lie as like cigarette embers being pushed onto my skin. And when Gramling says, in order to make America great again, we've got to make Dixie great again, readers of How the Word is Passed see clearly the white supremacist roots of the MAGA movement. But white attendees at the event do not. To try to understand, Smith strikes up conversations with them and listens. Jeff, a 63-year-old wearing a, quote, denim vest adorned with Confederate badges, end quote, explains why the lost cause is the truth, including the myths that there were Black Confederate soldiers and that the war was about states' rights. Of course, Smith reminds us the Confederate Army forbade free Black people from serving in their army as soldiers, and every single Confederate state declaration of secession cites slavery as a reason for leaving the United States. But historical facts will not persuade Jeff. As Smith said in an interview, for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It's a story they're told, an heirloom that's passed down across generations. It's something where loyalty takes precedence over truth. So, Smith says, if Jeff is to accept these facts, he would have to accept that his grandfather was lying to him. And if he has to accept that his grandfather was lying to him, that threatens to disintegrate his relationship with this person that he loves deeply. And so suddenly it becomes an existential crisis, because if so many of the stories that you've been told by the people you love are revealed to not be true, then your sense of identity, which is deeply entangled in those stories, deeply entangled in those relationships, is called into question. That's a hard thing for a lot of people. To challenge a person's understanding of history can, in effect, be challenging that person's sense of who they are. You are not just arguing about history. You are arguing about love. And you cannot refute love with facts. While some people may understand that history is complicated, most see their ancestors as the good guys. This is why an Ancestry.com advertisement asks, who are the heroes in your family? Seeing your ancestors as heroic makes you feel proud, raising the possibility that you may have inherited some of this heroic DNA. And for most white Americans, I hope, we want our ancestors to have opposed enslavement and supported civil rights. And for most descendants of white South Africans, I hope, we want our ancestors to have fought apartheid rather than have been complicit in it. Above all, we do not want to acknowledge that we are beneficiaries of the oppression of others. In response to that blog post, remember that blog post that I started with, acknowledging how racism informs my family history, my father claimed that I was without honor and said, I am deeply hurt that you are both ashamed of your father and ashamed of your heritage. These words really fascinate me. I'm not ashamed of my father or of my heritage, so I wonder if his allegation was a kind of confession, if the subtext was, reading this makes me feel ashamed of my heritage, and I now feel hurt and angry because I don't like feeling ashamed. I don't know, but I do know that without any clear paths towards reflection or remedy, shame can become toxic, and I think shame is too volatile and thus too risky a tool for anti-racist education. So this is also a response to its use in that context. Toxic shame can easily lead to anger at oneself, at others, or at both the self and others. And I don't think anyone should feel shame for national or personal histories over which they have no control. We should recognize that systemic advantages are a result of structural oppression, and in as much as we can address the resulting injustices, we should take responsibility for our family's role in perpetuating oppression, which may range from crimes against humanity to the indifference that sustains the status quo. But shame need not be a part of that process. Family histories are complex, dynamic mixtures of the national, colonial, racial, and gender histories from which they emerge. We may both admire our ancestors and view them thoughtfully and critically. And I see why my father admires ours. It's quite a story. In the early 1680s, Guillaume Neil, who was then only 18 or 19 years old, fled his home in Rouen, France. He was a member of the Huguenots, the country's Protestant religious minority. In 1598, King Henry IV's Edict of Nantes had granted the Huguenots the right to hold public office, to worship in certain areas, to run their own schools, and to travel freely. But Henry IV's grandson, King Louis XIV, did not share his grandfather's religious tolerance. And so for his own safety, Guillaume made his way to Amsterdam. And somewhere around the same time, Jean de la Botte also fled France for Amsterdam. They both got out just in time. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes. Any remaining Protestants either had to convert to Catholicism or risk death, and over the next decade, 150,000 would flee France. Jean de la Botte and Guillaume Niel married in Amsterdam in 1685 and 1688, sponsored by the Dutch East India Company. Guillaume, Jean, and their young son, Jean, boarded the ship de Chelles, headed for the Cape of Good Hope, where they would establish and manage a vineyard. Guillaume Niel became Willem Nel. He is my great times 8 grandfather, and Jean is my great times 8 grandmother. My father is named Pierre after Guillaume's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. As Owen Stanwood writes of the Huguenots, the persecuted Protestants of France often appear as singular Christian heroes. This has been especially true of those who ventured from France to the Americas or the Cape Colony of Southern Africa. So some Huguenot descendants see ourselves as the chosen ones, destined to bring the one true faith in European civilization to the world. That's a powerful story. At the time of the blog post, I knew only that my father, who does not speak French, was named Pierre in tribute to the Nels' Huguenot ancestry. I knew none of the rest of this. If I had, perhaps I would have been better prepared for his response. Or not. Our interpretation of the facts of this history would still diverge. Like some genealogists, he seeks to venerate our ancestors, and I understand why. I mean, after all, if not for the choices they made, we would not exist. Quite vividly, in the case of the Huguenots, whose flight from persecution introduced the word refugee into the English language, citizens only become refugees when they have no other options. My ancestors boarded a ship for Southern Africa, knowing that there's no turning back, and my great times 8 grandmother, Jean, gave birth on that ship, and in the Cape of Good Hope would have 8 more children, including my great times 7 grandfather, Pieter, which is the name for Pierre in Dutch. But I'm less interested in venerating and really more interested in understanding. And that story of the Huguenots as the chosen ones, well, it's a story, and it's not even an original one. Though refugees themselves, my ancestors and their descendants created refugees by taking land, labor, human rights from the San, the Kwe, the Xhosa, and 21 other indigenous peoples who already lived at what the colonizers called the Cape of Good Hope. And I need to expand on the histories of the San, the Kwe, and others, and I will in the full chapter. That's a deficit in this version that you're hearing right now. But anyway, to say that my ancestors survived because they were brave or resourceful is true, but it's a half-truth. They also survived because they were beneficiaries and agents of colonialism. And though their actions long precede my very existence, I too am a beneficiary of colonialism. Indeed, colonialism is the main reason that I know any of this history. Colonizers tend to diminish, rewrite, or erase the histories of those they colonize. They keep much better records of their own. And, venerating ancestors can lead down dangerous paths, really directly to Boym's restorative nostalgia, that enchanted world with clear borders and values when times were allegedly simpler, people worked hard, children were innocent, and America or Germany or Poland or South Africa was great. However, as Boym warns, in conflating the actual home and the imaginary one, such nostalgics can create a phantom homeland for the sake of which one is ready to die or kill. So when historical truth collides with your inherited understanding of truth, that powerful nostalgia that can emerge from the stories a family tells about itself, there's going to be resistance, such as invocation of historical context. Well, that's what people thought back then, which I have been guilty of too. I mean, for example, I tended to cut Dr. Seuss a bit of slack because he was a, quote, man of his time, and that's what people thought back then. But which people? All people everywhere? All white people? At all times, in any given place, all people did not think alike. The "they thought that way back then" claim presents past racism as inevitable, but racism is not inevitable. And I learned this from Robert Bernstein, who reminds us that in the United States, the range of racial beliefs has changed relatively little from the 19th century to the present. Now, the proportion of people who think particular thoughts has changed, but the, quote, array of thinkable thoughts, end quote, has not. So, in the same period that these 6 recently withdrawn Seuss books were published, we can find very different portraits of people of African descent in the children's books of Black writers like Langston Hughes and Arnold Bontemps, and of white writers like Hildegard Hoyt Swift and Lynn Ward. When we are willing to admit that we are wrong, we may discover that what we had thought to be true may at best be incomplete. So this first chapter is also an invitation to acknowledge the self that we bring to our critical work. The subjects we scholars choose to write about are not random. Our academic obsessions all have autobiographical roots. So in one sense, this chapter is my answer to the question of how I, as a straight cisgendered white guy, came to anti-racism and began learning how to become less racist. I often hear claims like, he doesn't have a racist bone in his body. But racism resides in the mind, not in the bones. And mending broken bones is far easier than removing racism from a mind that resists reflection. Responding to critics like me, who called out racism in Seuss's work, Seuss's grandnephew Ted Owen said, "I know one thing for sure. I never saw 1 ounce of racism in anything he said or how he lived his life or what his stories were about." Well, that claim relies on perception and intent, but of course, racism doesn't require either of those. Without intending to, Seuss recycled racist stereotypes, even as he was also writing stories that he intended as anti-racist parables. Seuss was the woke white guy who isn't as woke as he thinks he is. The same charge might be made of me. So when I'm writing about literature by members of minoritized groups, there will always be deficits in my understanding that emerge from the gap between my experiences and those that I am writing about. And more importantly, the presumption of scholarly objectivity always masks its ideological bias towards white Western modes of knowledge. Or as producer Ramona Martinez puts it, quote, "Objectivity is the ideology of the status quo." And this bias frequently emerges and demands that members of marginalized communities not include the personal, as when in 2016, the editor of the Children's Literature Association Quarterly rejected an important forum on the needs of minority scholars in children's literature. As transgender journalist Lewis Raven Wallace documents in The View from Somewhere, institutional insistence on objectivity, impartiality, and being unbiased invariably protects the interests of the powerful at the expense of the marginalized. Now, I'm not suggesting that we abandon research, ignore facts, or replace evidence with experience, but I am suggesting that since our experience often shapes what we're willing to admit as evidence, objectivity is not a goal to which we can realistically aspire. Instead, we should do what Wallace advises. We should aim for transparency and self-awareness. We should admit what we don't know. And as Wallace writes, we should not claim that oppressed people's voices be excluded on the false pretense that we are biased in favor of our own humanity, that we are too close to the story. As the Combahee River Collective wrote in 1977, the most profound and potentially most radical policies come directly out of our own identity. Now, since I am definitely not a minoritized identity, offering transparency, cultivating self-awareness, and admitting doubt both helps me keep my biases in check, and in undermining any pretense of objectivity, invites others to challenge my claims, which I hope you do in the conversation afterwards, because that in turn helps me to learn and to do better work, or I hope it does. I mean, I have my doubts. While I am writing this to serve anti-racist education, telling my story runs a very high risk of self-indulgent white man missing the point, centering the wrong group, white men. So there are a lot of ways in which this effort might fail. But I don't think I can examine the racism of the United States or children's literature without first considering how I have been shaped and sustained by white supremacy. And, to bring what is hidden into the open, one must be willing to expose the myths upon which the self is built. And for us white Americans, meritocracy may be the hardest myth to give up. To say that white people benefit from unearned privilege does not mean that all white people are lazy or wealthy. You can work hard and benefit from structural racism upon which white privilege itself is based. You can be poor and reap the rewards of whiteness. These benefits appear in large ways and small ones. When tracing their ancestry, descendants of enslaved Africans typically hit the brick wall of enslavement and must rely on DNA tests to speculate beyond the moment when their ancestors became property. Because my ancestors were not kidnapped and did not have their names and histories violently erased, I can trace my ancestry back 14 generations on my father's side and 10 generations on my mother's side. If my parents were Black South Africans, they would not have had access to education, opportunity, or even basic human rights. It's highly unlikely that a Black South African of my parents' generation would have been able to emigrate to the United States. That doesn't mean that my parents, didn't work hard or faced many, many challenges, but structural advantages made their hard work go further. And one does not need to consent to a structural advantage in order to benefit from it. And it's not a story that white Americans like to tell themselves, to tell ourselves. As Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in his new book, history is not inert, but contains within it a story that implicates the present. And framed a certain way, a story can be told that justifies the present political order. A political order is not just premised on who can vote, but on what they can vote for, which is to say on what unrealized possibilities can be imagined. Our possibilities are defined by our history, our culture, and our myths. And for this reason, in anti-racist education, stories are more persuasive than facts. Since racism infects the mind early, deeply, and in ways we're not aware, we may need to make an end run around the conscious mind. And we're more likely to listen to facts if they arrive in the form of a story, since narratives persuade via emotion, not reason. As Adam, a character in Richard Powers' Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Overstory, says, the best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story. And as the character Nile asks later in that same novel, what do all good stories do? He answers, they turn you into something you weren't. This is why multicultural children's literature is so effective, and this is why the American right is working tirelessly to ban multicultural children's literature. Stories can change you because stories can prick the conscience and can make the mind more receptive to facts. This is also why I am telling you a story. I began with conflict. If I'm doing a good job, then as I tell you related stories, your mind is perhaps subconsciously listening for clues as you wonder how and whether the conflict will resolve. I should say, though, that if you're looking for a clear villain or hero in my narrative, please don't. I want to agree here with the granddaughter of Fred Phelps, founder of the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas. It's about an hour's drive from where I live, from where I'm speaking to you right now. In case you're not familiar, the Westboro Baptist Church is a cult and hate group famous for its hate speech towards and harassment of gays, transgender people, Jews, Muslims, other Christian denominations, the families of dead soldiers. Megan Phelps Roper, the granddaughter of Fred, the church's founder, left the church and has become a public critic of it. But she also maintains ties to some family members who have remained loyal to her grandfather's church. Of her family, she says, I don't think they're bad people. I think they're good people who have been trapped by bad ideas. I want to agree with this because it recognizes the complexity of human beings and the addictiveness of hatred. For example, my father supports former President Donald Trump, a fascist, rapist, racist, and hate speech enthusiast. However, my father also has a capacity for kindness. When I was a child, he coached our soccer team, took us camping, took us hiking. At the age of 20, I fell asleep at the wheel, totaling my car. I was fine, by the way. using parts from that damaged car, he rehabilitated another car of the same make, and he gave that car to me. So if in recent decades his increasing addiction to bad ideas and conspiracy theories has diminished his capacity for generosity, it erases neither earlier good works nor my gratitude for them. But I am, sorry, my page is sticking together, but at the same time, I want to believe in the notion of good people trapped by bad ideas, because I cannot fully believe it. When bad ideas turn into acts, they have harmful effects in the real world, and the claim that these are good people quickly unravels. It's also more complicated than saying they're bad people. In her illuminating memoir, Killers of the Dream, Southern white educator Lillian Smith recalls trying to teach a young white camper in the 1940s about the realities of Jim Crow and segregation. The younger camper grows upset because, as the younger camper said, I just can't fight people I love, and I don't want to hate, and I don't want people to hate me. Ultimately, she concludes, I guess if you hated your family, it would be easier to fight for what is right. It would be easier if you don't care how much you hurt them. As Patricia J. Williams would write a half-century later, hatred is learned in the context of love. So this distinction between love and hate, between good and evil, is not clear-cut. Furthermore, as Aaron Halpern, Hebrew University of Jerusalem psychology professor and expert on intolerance, observes, people who hate are people who cannot tolerate ambiguity or complexity. Such binaries also encourage us to see racism or any other social evil as something that only others are susceptible to. But I am my father's son. I too can be stubborn, quick to judge, impatient, intemperate. And now, what will seem a strange pivot, but trust me, it is connected. In the 8th episode of the Apple TV series, Ted Lasso, the title character says, be curious, not judgmental. And I like this line because curiosity can cultivate empathy, and judgment does the opposite. In allowing you to claim superiority over others, judgment itself is an act of othering, an act that also prevents you from understanding yourself. For example, I am most critical of other people, aspects of myself that I do not like and maybe don't even acknowledge. But it's because that same tendency is in me that I respond so strongly. So instead of judging someone, I need to steer myself towards curiosity. And be curious, not judgmental, is also good practice for anti-racist education, because in suspending judgment, curiosity can develop empathy rather than othering. And I recognize this tendency towards judgment because my father was always generously offering you advice you did not seek, which conveyed the message that no matter what you were doing, you could never be good enough. What I didn't understand then was that this endless advice and judgment were forms of projection. When you offer unsought advice, you may well be seeing in others the faults you wish you could address in yourself. In all languages, to advise should be a reflexive verb. As much as we advice givers may wish to help, we are always talking, at least in part, to ourselves. So yes, you should also view my advice here critically, even skeptically. Though I am arguing here for empathy, I have to also acknowledge that empathy is risky. But we can never fully know what another person is feeling or experiencing. Imagining another person's interior life is just that. It's an imaginative act. And as such, empathy is subject to all the learned biases of the empathetic imaginer. As J.D. Davis writes in The Other Side of Empathy, which is her critique of empathy culture, to radically engage with people, whiteness must stop being the frame. Those on the other side of empathy must be allowed to be complicated, whole people. In lieu of empathy, she argues instead for radical love of the self and the other. And I really want to heed these cautions, that empathy runs the risk of reducing the empathized to a story, of becoming a form of pity, of depriving the empathized of agency. But I do think we've done well that an empathetic imagination can open the heart to the radical love of which Davis speaks. Empathy is not a substitute for action, though it can motivate action. Empathy is not the same as justice, though it can lead you to join the struggle. And it's important because I think one source of racism and other conspiracy theories is the failed attempt to avoid pain. As Cyrus Shams, the protagonist of Kaveh Akbar's novel Martyr, realizes about 2/3 of the way through the book, the performance of certainty seemed to be at the root of so much grief. Everyone in America seemed to be afraid and hurting and angry, starving for a fight they could win. The genesis of everyone's pain had to be external. Such was their certainty. But the next day, they wake up and find that what had hurt them still hurt. This echoes what James Baldwin writes in Notes of a Native Son when he says, I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. And acknowledging the sources of one's pain would help to heal the pain and would remove the need to direct that pain outward as anger or hatred, right? Another kind of projection. Unfortunately, the vulnerability required for this process frightens those who are suffering the most. Men in particular are socialized to believe that vulnerability is weakness. Many of us are so terrified of vulnerability that we deny our capacity to feel anything, pain, sadness, even joy. By limiting the possibilities for human connection, this aggressive denial feeds the loneliness that makes men easy targets for totalitarian movements. As Hannah Arendt famously observed, totalitarianism bases itself on loneliness, on the experience of not belonging to the world at all, which is among the most radical and desperate experiences of man. White civil rights activist Joseph Barnt recalls being told in 1966 by blacks he had marched with, "White man, go home and free your own people." He at first felt hurt, angry, and rejected, but later realized that he and other white allies were not being pushed out. As he says, rather, we were being pushed in the right direction. Being in white communities makes us, white people, well positioned to break other white people's addiction to racism. Because like all successful conspiracy theories, racism intoxicates its believers with a feeling of power, confirming that they are smarter, better, more deserving. And in so doing, it suppresses their pain, sadness, loneliness, those common human experiences that form the basis of empathy. And in diminishing the capacity to feel empathy, racism has a dangerous side effect. It poisons the soul. And yet, intolerance is so intoxicating that it feels nourishing. I mean, these people at these Trump rallies are enjoying themselves. When Audre Lorde said, "Your silence will not protect you," she was speaking, as she says, as a, quote, black lesbian poet who has, quote, been rendered invisible through the depersonalization of racism. And I'm a white, straight purveyor of prose. My position is very different from hers. But I like that line because silence is not going to protect white people either. Coming back to Baldwin again, he says, "The truth which frees black people will also free white people, but this is a truth which white people find very difficult to swallow." To make white people more receptive to that truth, we might speak directly about how racism damages even those it may materially benefit. In addition to making white people moral monsters, to quote Baldwin again, racism makes them dupes. As President Lyndon Johnson famously said, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you." Though I have never spoken at such length about my father's central role in my anti-racist education, when I've gestured to it, some have expressed sympathy. While that's very kind, if my story makes you sympathetic towards me, then I'm doing this wrong. What I really want to do here is document the damage that racism does to its proponents and their families, but I don't want to ignore or diminish the far greater harm that is done to racism's actual targets. And you know, all knowledge, even painful knowledge, is a gift. If you want it to be. No, let me revise that. I don't like that. I don't want to suggest that people should be grateful for their trauma, but I will say that I experience this knowledge as a gift. Now, I want to conclude by telling you that in following my own advice, I have repaired my relationship with my father and made some tentative efforts in anti-racist education, an affirming, uplifting ending. My father refused to accept my apology for the blog post, even after I honored his request to take it down. He stopped speaking to me 9 years ago. He is 86. We are unlikely to speak again. If you're tempted to hear this as a narrative in which my father chose racism over his own family, or in which I chose racism over my own family, please resist that temptation. That interpretation offers moral clarity, but it oversimplifies complexity. Also, this interpretation might discourage you from educating your own family or friends. And when presented new information in a sympathetic way, some people will respond with curiosity. There are plenty of people who just haven't had access to good information and who are eager to learn. So don't be discouraged. But do focus on the next generation. 10 days before my father's 10th birthday, the National Party won the 1948 elections and South Africa's apartheid era began. Now I'm going to guess he didn't grow up reading much in the way of multicultural children's literature or indeed receiving any messages of racial equality. 33 years later in the United States, while certainly not a paragon of anti-racist education, there was some, and when I was 12, I wrote and illustrated an 18-page anti-racist fable of sorts as part of a class assignment to create a children's picture book. It's about a friendship between a red dot and a blue dot, and Red's parents tell Blue that they can no longer play together, and happening upon a river, Blue sees Red struggling in the water. Blue dives in and saves Red, and the parents relent, and then the two resume being best friends. Look, it's not a great story, or even a good one, but as an early moment in my education, it is an indication of the power of stories to shape the imagination, and is an argument for why everyone needs inclusive literature. As Ruha Benjamin writes she writes, the whiteness of the curriculum in many schools not only stunts the potential of those from marginalized groups, but also narrows the worldview of those deemed privileged. She notes correctly that those who see themselves everywhere, a kind of structural narcissism, experience an inflated and unimpeachable sense of their own importance and rightness, becoming victims of their own brainwashing. Now, I know that multicultural and inclusive children's literature is not going to end racism. The United States both publishes inclusive literature for young people and may well return to the presidency a white supremacist who is promising mass deportation camps. As that candidate knows intuitively, and as research shows, it is easier to forge bonds based around shared hatred than around shared loves. And yet, if we start in childhood, we can learn to forge these bonds of love more effectively to better fight racism in children and in the adults they will become. Including on a Baldwin quote here, as he wrote, I am what time, circumstance, history have made of me, but I am also much more than that. So are we all. Indeed, so are we all. All right, that's the end of the talk. That maybe I should stop sharing the slides and open the floodgates to questions, critique, suggestions for revision. As I say, this is the first draft, and it's a different kind of writing for me. So I'm sure there's a lot I'm doing wrong. So bring it on.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking, first of all, and a vulnerable talk. I'm pretty sure that there will be tons of questions. I can already see the first little raised hand. But I also think that some of us need to process everything that you have said. And I for sure do have a question connected to history and erasing history. But Olivia Majkowska has a question. So Olivia, please go ahead. Ask our first question this evening.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. Really enjoyed it. So you mentioned that benefiting from white supremacy is not always a choice. And so we become complicit in certain dynamics, and it's not always something we consciously agree to. And to me, being born as part of certain demographics is an obvious example of this. But I'm wondering, what would be other areas of life where this benefit, not by choice, is most palpable, and what can we do to better recognize ourselves in it?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm focusing on racism in this talk, but I mean, any social structure in which we are born into that benefits us. I mean, I'm a straight, white, cisgendered dude, raised in a upper middle class household. I mean, there's all kinds of benefits that were invisible to me as a kid, because your world as a child is just the world. It's natural. It's normal. It's everybody. It's everything. The only way you recognize that. I mean, what can be done, or the second part of your question, what can be done to make yourself aware? Go to and read and watch works of art, whether they're films or books or comic strips or dance performances, or music of groups who are not you. That is a way to decenter yourself. And of course, for scholars of children's literature, that's why we teach inclusive children's literature. I'll tell you something I learned from Professor Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, whose work you probably know, and if you don't, you should read The Dark Fantastic and the great new book she has with Sarah Park Dolan on Harry Potter and the Other. But the first time I taught multicultural children's literature, I asked people for advice, people who taught it before, several people, 4 or 5 people, and took notes and, tried to do it right. But one thing she said has always stuck with me, which she said, I teach my literature for children class as a multicultural children's class, as a multicultural children's literature class. So here's that syllabus. And I thought, well, yeah, like, why don't I do that for my children's literature class? I mean, of course, I didn't just teach books by white dudes or straight white dudes at all, but like, why not center that in that? What was this imaginary fealty that I had to some notion of what is important, and so after that, my children's literature class centers diversity and multicultural children's literature also, without announcing it as such. I just do it. But that's a way in which your imagination, gets shaped, gets colonized, gets influenced in ways you're not aware. And somebody says, "Oh, I just teach this way," and you think, "Well, why didn't I do that?" So that's a long and rambling answer, and I'll stop now. I mean, I'll ramble to somebody else, or if there are no other questions, everyone has the rest of the evening off, or afternoon, depending on where you are, or morning. I don't know.
I'm sure that there will be more questions. Yeah, we already have another question. We have 2. Basha, please go ahead, and then Yulia.
Phil, I'm deeply grateful for this insightful yet so open, personal and moving lecture, a true embodiment of reflective nostalgia you were talking about, which was one of the main threads of your lecture on meta level, let's say. And I'm really touched by this talk, and what prompted you to write this your first such autobiographical book. And I'm impressed with the work you've done to reach back to 14th generation, and you've been discovered Dutch ancestors. It feels like we have something in common, because I'm teaching Dutch literature. So Please tell me what prompted you to write this personal book.
Well, it's only the first chapter, which is personal. I thought it was going to be an entire book, and then I thought, no, it's just the first chapter. And I thought, no, it's really a framing device for the first chapter, because I'm not that interesting. And also, I don't want to center. I don't want to center whiteness, and that's why I think a real deficit in what you heard so far is I have to do that work for the San, for the Kwe, for the Kosa. I have to do that work from the South African side, which I'm in the process of doing. But what inspired me is a few things. I think when people talk to you directly in the Q&A, in an interview, maybe for the media, and you kind of drop the scholarly mask a little bit and just talk, I think that reaches people in a way that your scholarship doesn't. I think there's something about the vulnerability of that, which is persuasive. And so I thought, can I do this and use this in a way that will be socially productive? Because I don't want it to just be self-indulgent. And I would be really grateful for anybody here who can like call out that stuff. As I was revising this, I was trying to throw out as much of that as I could. I don't know if I succeeded, but so that's one thing. I think there is something persuasive about talking as you. And then also, as I said in the talk, I think stories persuade people. And I think, as I say, I think that's why they're being targeted, you know, in the US. I think they really are persuasive. And so if I can use my story to persuade people, especially white people, well, then that's what I should do with it, right? Like that's pretty much the only good use of that I can think of. And then I guess third, on a personal level, yeah, and I cut this from the talk. Maybe it goes in the chapter, maybe it doesn't. But my willingness to look at hatred is autobiographical. For the paperback of Was the Hat in the Hat Black, I decided I would write a new afterword based on my hate mail. And that was partially inspired by Gloria Wecker, who did that for the Van Abbey Museum of Art exhibit on Zwarte Piet. And that was very hard for her as a scholar of color. You know, she read a lot of work, I think 1,500 pieces of hate mail that were directed at her person. And she said it was like drinking an undiluted dose of poison. That's not actually my experience, because you can't dehumanize me. You just can't. Like, all of the inherited privileges sustain me and create a kind of armor. But what motivated me to do that was the hate mail, you know, whether it was on comments and articles about the book or social media posts or, you know, actual email directed to me. It had a familiar and familial flavor to it. And so I think what drew me to that was trying to understand, you know, trying to understand why someone who is otherwise intelligent, such as my father, would arrive at such a toxic position. So that's also what I mean too when I say knowledge is a gift, or I experience it as a gift. You know, like that is a genuine gift to be able to make that connection, and I owe that to him. So I guess that's a long-winded three-part answer, but we'll stop now. If I get to a fourth part, people will be rushing for the exits. Maybe they're already rushing for the exits. That's one of the values of doing these online talks. You have no idea if anyone's paying attention or has it on mute while they're doing something else. So, but thank you for the question. It's very, very kind and generous.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. We have two more questions, which means that people are still listening, that people have been listening. So we don't need to worry. So Julia,
it's optional. If people have other things to do, they can certainly do them. So.
Okay, so then me. Hi, hello, thank you for the lecture. I have weird question, I think, because I want to ask, do you think that Poles may have a different perspective on racism because we practically had no history of colonialism?
I think you would have to answer that question because I don't have any expertise in Polish history or colonialism. The premise of your question suggests that there are differences. And certainly when I've talked to people from other countries, one of the really fascinating objects of the discussion is the differences, right? And that like an anti-racist education approach in the US might not be transferable, you know, to one in another country. Ada Bieber and I co-wrote a piece on multicultural German children's literature to think about that, right? So I would guess there would be more persuasive or different or you know, distinct ways of addressing this in Poland. I feel like I should ask you. I feel like the answer is built into your question. So I'm going to ask you. What do you think the difference is?
Yeah, that was built in my question, because I think we think that we are less racist than the other country because we have no history of colonialism. But I think we can still be racist. And when I watch films with the history of Black people, and I saw that, I think that was very brutal, and I think that we are not aware of that, how brutal it was.
Yeah, that's probably true. I think all of our national mythologies have baked into them certain ideas that we're not encouraged to question. I grew up with the notion that America was a land that welcomed immigrants and was this kind of great multicultural beacon of democracy. There are times in American history where we've welcomed immigrants. There are many people who did not immigrate here by choice. There are people who lived here already, right? That wasn't part of the story that I heard. And as for being sort of this uniquely, beacon of democracy in the world, you don't have to just look at the present to realize the lie of that. For most of its history, America has not been a democracy. There are sort of two distinct periods where we aim for a kind of multicultural democracy. That's after the Civil War, the Reconstruction period from 1865 to 1877, and the period of the Voting Rights Act, which is 1965 to 2013. The reason you see so much chaos now around voting is that was in the Supreme Court case Shelby versus Holder overturned, or at least stripped of any power. And so all of the kind of versions of the Jim Crow era voting restrictions are back. But so there's like, I don't know, if you add up those years, you get something like, I don't know, 62 or 60 something years in which we're attempting a multiracial democracy. And for the first set, it was only men who could vote, and Black men were elected to Congress in the 19th century. During that period. So the myth collides with the reality, with the actual history, the closer you look at it. And my guess is that would be true wherever you live in the world, that, we all have our national mythologies that we become conscious of as mythologies, the more we look closely at them. So, but thanks for the question. And maybe that's a subject you should write about, since you have expertise, which I lack.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question from Dominika. Dominika, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, and thank you so much for your frankness. And I especially wanted to thank you for affirming the importance of curiosity, which is very heartening for me, because I'm working on a project on interest as an affect, and what it can do in literature and between the reader and the text. So I'm so grateful that you actually highlighted this. It's heartening for me. I also had a kind of reflection and a question. Do you feel that inclusion of difference on the symbolic level can prompt, or in some way further inclusion, for instance, on the economic level? This is a question that has been asked around multiculturalism. We haven't come up with anything that is much better than multiculturalism, but critics point out that the society in the US is more stratified and more segregated by class than it was before the onset of multiculturalism. And today, Elon Musk invested, I just read, some $250 million in the Trump campaign to further increase the segregation and stratification in the U.S. in some ways. So, do you think there is some sort of a trend? Does representation on the symbolic level and inclusion have potential to actually change how society functions structurally? Have you seen how this works? Have thought about how this works?
I mean, I think it's one component, but you're quite right. I mean, the extraordinary and the vast inequality in this country is part of what makes it so susceptible to fascism, right? And fascist and fellow South African, Elon Musk. Shout out to South Africans. I actually wasn't born in South Africa, but you know. But yeah, he's exploiting that because well, I don't know. He's I think I'm not going to try to explain Elon Musk, but I will say.
But the hero worship of Elon Musk is something else. I mean.
Yeah. Well, and dear leader Trump too. You know, there's this kind of belief in a savior figure that gets applied to both of them, even though Trump is an absolutely, terrible businessman and really just one of the worst human beings, I think. I mean, I don't know. He's got to be up there. I guess comparisons are hard, but I'm always struck by the fact that the embodiment of the 7 deadly sins has such a strong support under people who consider themselves evangelicals, evangelical Christians. I think, like, really, did you read the book? But my guess is not closely. But yeah, I think this desire to turn towards a strong man or someone who presents himself as a strong man or a strong leader or a strong savior is something that desperate people are inclined towards it, and I get it. If you're suffering, if the promise that you have been given is not being borne out in your life, then you give up on democracy. Yeah, of course. I mean, I that's a mistake, but I can see why you would, and I think so. Yeah, I don't think multicultural children's literature is. Will solve all of our problems by any means. I think there are there are many things that need to be addressed, and the inequality of opportunity is huge. Whether that's childcare or family leave or, geez, I mean, even just like if you have birth, like. If you give birth, you should just be paid for a while you're, not working. Like, we don't have that. Like, which is bonkers, especially in a country that claims to care about children. We don't. This country doesn't care about children at all. But that's another. Well, it's a related conversation, but it's another conversation that is kind of exposes the hypocrisy of a lot of the arguments that are being making about, oh, I don't know, critical race theory, indoctrinating children or whatever. The same people who argue for that are happy to have guns everywhere, which I feel is just slightly more lethal than critical race theory, since it involves bullets and death. But I'm just pontificating now, so maybe I should stop. So
no, I appreciate that answer, and I wasn't trying to trip you up. I was asking about a conundrum that I keep running into and worrying about as I work. So thank you again.
You're quite right. I mean, the social structure in this country has been deliberately unraveled over the past 45 years or so. Really, Reagan kind of began the acceleration of that, and removing those social structures makes the at risk even more at risk. And that is a huge problem, and that creates the kind of social instability that we have now. So yeah, absolutely right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your answer. And Dominika, thank you for your question. Actually, during your talk, Phil, I was thinking about Dominika's American literature classes and how the syllabi are constructed. We're teaching American literature as multicultural literature. It's just multicultural. And it's just what you mentioned about just people, teaching children's literature without just labeling it multicultural. I think that is something that has to be done to just literature in general and we cannot just, if we only stick to the canon, and the canon is usually white,
Right.
we're doing something that is just that prevents people from becoming curious, from learning about different people, from the others, let's say. Of course, I'm not only talking about race, I'm also talking about all different types of otherness. So it's just a comment. so I'm very happy that asked her the question. So
you're quite
we
right.
don't have time.
Right,
yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for questions, but also during your talk, I kept on thinking about this one quote from your book, from one of your previous books, in which you write that nostalgia can mystify ideology, and I think that it's that we really need to think about nostalgia. We need to remember that nostalgia is bittersweet, and we tend to focus on the sweetness too much. Quite often, but it's bittersweet, and the bitter element is as important as the sweet one. So, Phil, thank you so much for being with us today. It has been a great honor, and of course, we're looking forward to seeing you in Wrocław in person, maybe one day. Yes, Ella. Yeah, Ella, please go ahead.
Sorry, mistake.
Yes. Now, Ella, so can you say a few words about the next talk in the series? Maybe we can already endorse it as we know the speaker.
Yes, of course, we will send you the invitation, but today we can invite all of you for the next lecture that will be on the, Mateusz, help me, 19th of
19th of November, which is a Tuesday.
Yes, and
it's Tuesday,
it will be
Wednesday.
at 7 p.m. this time.
Yes. And
but, we will send you all the information
Yes.
and the invitation with the link to the to forms. Yes, when you can subscribe
register.
for the register.